Hi, I'm Holly Mackay, CEO of Boring Money, a free independent website that offers consumers help with navigating their investments and pensions. I'm delighted to be your host today for this masterclass webinar, Preparing for the UK Budget, a Telegraph Media Group hosted event for Netwealth. Please note that this event and the discussion today are for information purposes only, and they don't constitute personal financial advice. We're going to be discussing what we can expect to see from Rachel Reeves' second budget on the 26th of November, the policy environment and what all of this means for your savings and investments, and hear how Netwealth helps its clients with financial planning and advice. With me today are Matt Conradi and Gerard Lyons. Matt Conradi is Head of Client Advisory at Netwealth. He's worked over the past 15 years with clients and families to build their financial plans and manage their investments. And Gerard Lyons is a leading UK economist and influential analyst of the global economy, as well as an author and podcaster. He's also Chief Economic Strategist at Netwealth. Gerard and Matt, thank you very much for joining me today. Gerard, if I can come to you first. We've heard so much in the news already about the budget coming up on the 26th of November, and Rachel Reeves is staring down the sort of gun of having to balance the books.
Yes.
And the numbers don't look great, Gerard. Can you give us a sense of what's going on?
Yeah, well, the numbers don't look good, and as a result, this will be a very economically damaging budget for the economy. That's because the Chancellor is likely to take at least £28 billion out of the economy. That's to actually sort of balance the books, so to speak. So she's going to take part in fiscal tightening through higher taxes as opposed to cutting spending. Really, the background is this, that the Chancellor has self-imposed fiscal rules. She didn't leave herself much headroom, much buffer, and that buffer has been eaten up by the government's inability to curb spending and also by higher interest rates in terms of market yields compared to last year. Then on top of that, the independent forecaster, the OBR, has taken a more downbeat view of the economy, and they're cutting their productivity in other forecasts. So when you add all that up, it points to the Chancellor having to find at least £28 billion to actually meet her fiscal rules and to restore her headroom to the small amount that it is.
To someone sitting here like myself, £28 billion is a very large number. What are her options, Gerard? What is she likely to do?
Well, it is a large amount of money. The government spends over £1.3 trillion. So the best route would have been to start to curb spending, but that's not where we are given the politics. So it's come down to taxes. And for the Chancellor, it's really a choice of two things. A piecemeal approach, namely lots of small taxes that added up together get you to at least £28 billion, or to actually decide to change one of the main taxes. By main taxes, I mean national insurance, income tax or VAT. Because these have a broad tax base, many people pay the tax. That means if you want to raise a lot of money through tax changes, they're the taxes you really should be changing. But the Labour Party in its manifesto ruled out changing any of those taxes. To give you an idea, 1 pence on VAT raises £9.2 billion. You could actually increase income tax by twopence and you get over £16 billion. If you raise the top rate of income tax by 5 pence, you get over £10 billion. So these are big amounts of money. Now, what will she do? She could actually go for a halfway house in one of the taxes. A tax switch has been advocated. That is, you cut national insurance and you raise income tax. And if you cut national insurance, say, by twopence and raise income tax by twopence, then people in work don't pay any higher tax. And that would allow the government, in theory, to say they haven't broken their manifesto commitment. And you pull more people into the higher rate of tax or the higher income tax. And to do something like that, you probably actually might want to do it by more than twopence. You might want to sort of say go 4 pence. But the point is that she has a choice to go down the piecemeal approach or down the approach of making changes to the big taxes. In all likelihood, apart from that tax switch, it's going to be the piecemeal approach, which means trying to raise taxes on property, maybe on pensions, certainly raise taxes on gambling, and maybe raise taxes on banks. Now, for the financial markets, the markets want her to make sure that anything she does not only closes that fiscal gap, but is credible doesn't damage the economy too much. But also what the markets ideally would like is for her to actually not only restore her headroom, but to increase that headroom, that buffer, by a lot more than it currently is, so we don't repeat this scenario with a Groundhog Day this time next year. But if she was to do that, then she would have to raise even more than £28 billion in taxes. So bottom line is this. She's opted politically not to curb spending. She's going down the route of taxes. When you go down the route of taxes, ideally you change the main taxes because that allows you to close that gap easily. Yeah. But if you don't do that, then we have a whole piecemeal approach which adds to the uncertainty impacting savers, investors and businesses more generally.
Thank you, Gerard. And Matt, if I can sort of come to you, this piecemeal approach we've heard about, it's really fueling the rumour mill, isn't it? And I imagine your clients are worried, phoning you up. What are they saying, Matt?
Well, yeah, absolutely, Holly. I think this idea that we've heard pretty much every potential tax being discussed as maybe changing means that everyone has one they're more worried about. And it's the things that are most relevant to them or most emotive to them. The calls we're getting, the conversations we're having are around pensions, tax-free lump sums. And we might talk about those a bit more later. Inheritance tax, that's a big one. And some of the taxes around properties. And there are things that people feel either unfair or they're worried about the impact it has on their plans. And I think that's the challenge. It's very hard for most people to work out what a potential change, well, A, what the probability of it happening is, and B, what it might actually mean for their plans, because it's not that tangible. So some of them might feel very worrying, but not have too big an impact on their plans, whereas others that they're not even thinking about could have a much bigger impact through time. And that's the challenge that I think people face.
And of course, we're second guessing, aren't we? The kind of rules of financial planning that we've all been brought up with are make a plan for the long term, stick with the plan, don't let people rattle your cage. But people's cages are rattled. If we can come to pensions, Matt, as an area that the rules seem to be sort of shifting around us, can you tell us what are the rules today about tax-free cash? And then what do people sort of worry about happening? Then we can come on to whether it's wise to act or not.
Yeah, absolutely. The rules have changed so much, and the rules around tax-free cash have actually changed quite a lot as well, the levels you can get. So today, the way it works is you have something called a lump sum allowance. And every time you crystallise your pension, you start to draw an income from it, or perhaps you use it to buy an annuity, you crystallise a portion of your pension, and you can take 25% of that as a pension commencement lump sum, a tax-free lump sum it's often talked about, up to the level of your lump sum allowance. And that's around £268,000 if you have a big enough pension to do that. And one of the concerns people have is that their planning is on the basis of having this tax-free amount. And I think the other point is it's tax-free in their heads, and that's quite emotive. We don't get many tax-free things. No. And so the concern is that either it will be scrapped altogether or that it will be reduced the amount they can draw tax-free through time. And so people are perhaps taking it sooner than they should do, or worrying about that changing through time as well. I mean, I think we should remember that changes to the tax-free lump sum have been talked about every single budget, probably for the last 10 years, and have never changed. There's a lot of people who plan around that, and it is factored into their long-term plans. So there would be a lot of people impacted by it. And the other thing I think to note around that is that if something changes, it has to change on the day for you to not have time to react to it. So you talked about when we make financial plans, we always try to work with the rules that we're faced by at that moment in time and make sensible decisions. Because if you try and preempt too much, the danger is you do something you regret later on. So I think the probability of it happening on the day is relatively low. Because the industry as a whole is set up to deal with it in that way as well, and so on.
Right, so they couldn't even process it, the pension providers, were this to come in. So I'm hearing then you think people, even if changes might be coming, people might have time to sort of anticipate and plan rather than feeling there's this sense they've got to do stuff before the 26th of November.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a really natural human experience to feel like you want to do something. I've made an action, I've done something. Well, I would say the first thing you should do is just understand where you are. That's the action you should take. Understand your picture and whether taking your lump sum is right for you or not in a normal circumstance. Because then if the rules do change and we have to do something, say, before April next year, which is a sort of normal period of when changes would come in after a budget, you'll be ready to act in that period of time. But you don't have to try and preempt it and do something that you later regret.
I'm going to bring in some reader questions, if I may. We've had quite a lot on these. Someone has written in saying he's going to be 55, so the age you can start to draw down money, 2 weeks after the budget, and he's hoping to take his lump sum. In a way, is that an easier question because he's not 55 yet, so he can't take the money out anyway?
In some ways, yes. And I think it highlights that point as well. It's not worth worrying about things that you can't change. So we'll talk about property later on. There'll be some things you can do and some things you can't. And with that pension, exactly, you have to wait until 2 weeks after the budget, whatever happens. But you can be ready to act if that's the right thing to do at that moment in time. I always found a bit sort of conflicted about the 55 period. It's great that it incentivises people to stay in their pension for the long term. And when I'm talking to someone in their 30s and 40s, it's great. I can say, you've got a super long time horizon, you can invest for growth and so on. But it also means that at the point of 55, which is probably still quite early for most people towards retirement, and particularly if you think about your retirement pod is going to last your whole retirement, so another 30 years, it forces people to make a decision perhaps too early. And they jump to saying, I must take my tax-free cash. And we see these things like it sitting in a bank account afterwards, which is a terrible bit of planning. I mean, in some ways, it would be great if it was actually there and you had a decision and then you move forward a little bit later and made a decision later, because actually 55 is still quite early.
So no rushing. Is that what you're saying to sort of clients? Are there any conversations you're having with clients who are worried about this, where there are circumstances today that make you think, well, actually, given this change could be on the cards, you should maybe act now?
Yeah, there are a couple that we actually have started to talk to people about that. So if you were going to take your tax-free lump sum, say to pay off a mortgage, and you were planning to do that in January, and you're over 55 and you can do it today, then it probably makes sense to do it today, just in case. So even though I think the probability is low, that's something where 3 or 4 months difference of having the money out of your pension doesn't make much difference. So probably do that. But you have to know that was the plan and that made sense to do that, to make that decision. Similarly, we're talking to some clients who are over age 75. And they're thinking about potentially taking their lump sum because there's quite an interesting tax change that happens at that point in time. And this is really where people have perhaps left their pension more to pass to future generations. You talked about pension rules changing a lot. One of the changes that came in at the last budget was that pensions are going to move into the estate for IHT from April 2027.
For inheritance tax.
For inheritance tax, exactly. And so for those people that are over 75 and haven't taken their tax-free lump sum, it might make sense to take it, because actually it makes sense to review that at 75 anyway, because if you pass away, your beneficiaries pay income tax on the withdrawals from the pension. So those are the two nuanced situations where we would say it's worth thinking about doing that. But in most instances, not panicking, not trying to preempt is probably more sensible.
Matt, we've talked and heard quite a lot about potential changes to tax-free cash. That can make people feel a bit negative about pensions. But I feel it's really important to remind people of the benefits of pensions and the massive tax benefits they have, particularly as tax thresholds are being frozen, more people being dragged up into higher tax thresholds. So they are still a compelling way for people to manage their tax bill.
Yeah, absolutely. They're still one of the best long-term savings and investing vehicles out there. So you get tax relief on the way in. So that might be higher rate tax relief, as you mentioned there. It might bring you down below the 100,000 income threshold. If you're not aware of this is the point where you start to lose your personal allowance. So your tax rate's around 60%. You can manage how much you put in over time. That's really attractive. And then everything inside grows tax-free. Assuming we keep the 25% tax-free lump sum, you get that part out, but you can also manage money out on the way out as well. So we talk to clients a lot about when you've got a pension pot and maybe your spouse has got one, you've got some ISAs, you've got some taxable funds, blending your income out so you pay less tax than the relief you got in the way in, which makes it a really, really powerful vehicle through time. You can invest in lots of different ways as well. So I really would encourage people to think about pensions. It's one of those ones as well about compounding. So a little bit more put in every month early on has a huge impact through time. There has been some discussion about them maybe changing the way tax relief works on pensions. It's gone quiet of late, but I wouldn't put it past it coming back onto the agenda again. There was some suggestion of maybe cutting some of the higher rate tax relief on the way in. So if you're thinking that you're going to use that pension vehicle to help perhaps bring your income down to maybe get you free childcare, which is also cut off at 100,000, or change that personal allowance, maybe that's something you could do before the budget. Just make that pension contribution if you can afford to do it and you've got the cash. That's a really prudent and sensible thing to do.
Just one thing it made me think of. Obviously, if you're in number 11, you've got all this bad news. You want to try and seize the initiative, so at least there's some positive headlines the next day, not just for your backbenchers. But as Matt touched on, it's not just the pensions, but the tax system needs simplification. We have very high marginal tax rates when you go above £60,000, and again, if you're lucky enough to go above £100,000. So they might try and make the system simpler. To try and remove some of those high marginal tax rates. Doesn't get away from the fact there's lots of money being pulled out of the economy, but don't be surprised if they try and make something positive out of this to try and at least steal the headlines
so
the next
we're
morning.
taxing you a lot more, but at least you'll understand what we're taxing
in
you.
a simpler way, a more transparent way. But there are things that you really would be wanting to do to try and get some of those headlines on your side the day after the budget. But it's going to be a tall order to try and do that.
Gerard, a question for you, because we've had a lot of reader questions as well about property, and particularly over recent days, actually, the rumour mill seems to have shifted a bit from pensions to property. At Netwealth, what's your view on what we might be in store for when it comes to interest rates?
Yeah. Well, in terms of interest rates are currently at 4%. In all likelihood, they will trend lower, not immediately, but in the new year. If fiscal policy is tightened, as is inevitable in this budget, then that will make it more likely that interest rates fall in the new year. Inflation is currently 3.8%. The Bank of England has done a terrible job at keeping inflation under control. But the likelihood is that rates go down from 4% to 3.5% by next summer. It's possible they could go lower than that if the economy takes the budget and other events very badly indeed and starts to flatline. So low rates. But in terms of property, see, the UK actually taxes property very highly. Second highest property taxes in the Western world. Now, we tax property very badly. So what's likely in this budget is at least some simplification of property taxes. Now, if it's only that, then that would be welcome. But it's not only likely to be a simplification, it's also likely to be additional taxes as well. By simplification, I mean that property is taxed on council taxes of 1991. There's been a lot of talk about bringing that up to date. And also we have high stamp duty, and high stamp duty really basically deters turnover and transactions. And indeed, in the major review of the UK tax system about 15 odd years ago, Professor Merles, who was not prone to using loose words, called stamp duty a stupid tax. So it is a stupid tax. Now, the thing is, we might not just have a simplification, we might also have the government trying to go for higher taxes on property. What has been talked about is an annual tax on property over a certain amount of money. £500,000 was rumoured a few months ago. Now it's rumoured at being £1.5 million. And also in the last few weeks, the idea of a mansion tax, capital gains on property, has come back in. All this is bad news because anything that deters turnover is not good for the property sector.
Clogs up the market.
Yeah, regardless of what level you are. And the other thing we have to bear in mind is almost 7 out of 10 sort of, shall we call them white van man in London, sole traders, they work in areas linked to the property sector. So what happened in France when you went down this route, albeit a few decades ago, starting to tax property too heavily, it deterred people from upgrading their property. And if that happened here, then it would actually have a big ramification and a negative one. So interest rates not changing immediately after the budget, likely to trend lower in the new year, and changes on property tax definitely.
What about, Matt, do you have clients and questions coming in? There's reader questions we'll come to in just a second from people who are landlords, they have second properties. These landlords have been clobbered increasingly over sort of years, haven't they? Do you think there's more bad news ahead for people who own second properties or who are landlords?
I think it's definitely a risk because, politically, the government is trying to look for places where they can not be accused of hitting the working man or woman on the street. And so it's easy to say, if you own a second property, if you're a landlord, you must be wealthy, and that's an area to look at as well. And so we have seen lots of changes in that part. There's been some discussion around adding things like national insurance to the property income taxes as well, which might come in. And we're having more and more conversations with individuals where they're saying it's just not worth it. With all of these additional taxes, we've had great capital gains, but they do feel a bit trapped by those capital gains that have built up over time. And what we're trying to help them is to say, look, it's not about paying no tax. It's about working out what the right tax is to pay at the right time. So if you say sell a property and then gift that money to a child who needs it perhaps for childcare, for paying down their mortgage or something, and that also reduces your inheritance tax bill, that was a worthwhile bit of tax to pay. And there's a lot of psychology to this. It's really hard to see something that you value at, say, £500,000 a second property, and then pay tax on that because you've lost value on day one. And that feels difficult to do. But if you think about it in the context of a wider plan, it might be exactly the right thing to do. And so those are the conversations we're starting to have about property.
You've touched on inheritance then, you've touched on gifting. I mean, obviously this has been in the news, there's sort of been changes to the rules around pensions, inheritance tax. Before we look at what might change, can you just remind us of what the current rules are around inheritance tax today?
Yeah, absolutely. So everyone gets a nil rate band for inheritance tax, which is £325,000 per person or £650,000 for a couple. Above that level, then there's going to be inheritance tax charged, generally at 40%. There is a residence nil rate band. If you have a primary residence and you pass it on to your direct beneficiaries or your direct descendants, then that can add another £175,000 per person, so £1 million in total. It's a little bit complex because if your estate goes over 2 million, then you start to lose that allowance again. And the government is very keen to always say, well, actually, the vast majority of estates don't pay inheritance tax. And that's probably true. Some of that, though, is because people get on and do gifting and manage that through time. And we have something that is quite a generous provision, something called the potentially exempt transfer, or often thought of as the 7-year rule on gifts. Essentially, you can gift as much as you like to anyone you like, and if you live 7 years, it's outside of your estate. And that's quite a generous provision. In countries where inheritance tax is in place, that's not always the case. And there's been some speculation about that changing. And that's been one of the areas that people are quite concerned about. And that's one of the things we've had many questions on.
Do you think we've talked a little bit about national insurance and whether this is sort of going to be a reader question? There's talk that national insurance will be payable on rental income. On the basis that people of pension age do not pay national insurance, is it likely this exemption will also apply to rental income?
I mean, it's really hard to know. They certainly need to do something in that area. I think we also need to think about whether national insurance is just another general tax, in which case perhaps it should be looked at. And there's been some suggestions, as Gerard was saying, about changing in national insurance and increasing income taxes as well. It's certainly a risk that's out there. And I think, as we said before, properties will come under attack for that a little bit. We've seen similar things also talking about other ways people earn income and is it fair? So partnerships were talked about most recently. Should they be paying national insurance as well? And they don't currently on partnership profits. So I think that's certainly a risk.
Anything she can do to claw more people into paying higher tax. The reality is, behind the scenes, national insurance and income tax aren't really that different. Each tax has a designated destination it goes to. So since the 1860s, income tax has gone to the Consolidated Fund, national insurance goes to the National Insurance Fund. So they can argue in theory they're different. But behind the scenes, if national insurance has too much money, it goes into the general account. And when it's short of money, hey, presto, it pulls it out of the Consolidated Fund. So behind the scenes, really, they're just taxes. But what the Chancellor is trying to do is to make sure she can catch even more people, hence the talk about changing national insurance, charge it on renting, and also that tax switch that I've referred to earlier. So it's about how can we close that gap and pull more people in while sticking to the manifesto commitment, in theory, that working people, however you define them, don't pay more tax. Hey presto.
So Matt, another reader question we've had in, can you talk about bare trusts for IHT exemption?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this goes back to this idea that you can give money away as a potentially exempt transfer. So let's assume that we can do that and there's a 7-year rule for that. Then what you can do, if you're a grandparent, normally this is the case, you might give money directly to a grandchild. And because they're under 18, a minor, it has to be held in something called a bare trust. And it's a simple trust that you look through directly to the child. Why would you want that? Well, you want that because that means it's taxed on the child. And if the child, and most children under 18, don't have any other income or capital gains, they have their allowances they can use. So it can be really tax efficient. Some people might say, well, there's a junior ISA. Why wouldn't I use that for the same purpose? Well, the difference is in a junior ISA, that money accrues to the child and is theirs at 18 and can't be touched before. In a bare trust, you can spend it for their benefit. So if a grandparent sets up a bare trust as part of their overall planning and gifting, it might be controlled by the parents or the grandparents. It can then be invested. It can generate income without probably paying too much tax, as long as it's not too large a pot. And it can be spent on things like school fees. It could be spent on holidays. It can be spent on anything for the benefit of the child through time, which is quite an attractive setup. So it's based on this idea that you can give money away, and if you live 7 years, it's passed on. But it takes advantage of that, the rules around bare trust and taxing it on the child, which makes it quite attractive.
Thank you, Gerard. You've spoken quite candidly. You have a relatively gloomy expectation, I would say, of what's going to happen with the budget. Are there any reasons to be cheerful? I'm trying to find something to animate the listeners, but Is there anything out there?
Well, in last year's budget, the Chancellor did announce plans to boost investment, which was good, but that takes time to feed through. But that was more than overshadowed by the higher taxes last year, which are hitting hard. The positives this year are hard to find. The positive maybe is that at least there will be certainty after the budget. In the UK, even though the economy is weak and relatively stable, but very weak, we have a situation where many people are building up savings and many companies' balance sheets are not too bad. But people are not spending. Companies are wary of investing. If we get the uncertainty out of the way, then it's possible that people might feel more confident about spending. The challenge, though, as I alluded to, is that the Chancellor won't rebuild her buffer. So this uncertainty will start to reappear next year. Unfortunately, the bottom line is this. Britain is a low productivity, low wage, low growth economy. And in recent years, it's become a high public spending, high tax and high borrowing economy. When you look at the options, there are 5 options for any Chancellor: grow, reform, austerity, borrow, tax. You grow the economy. I don't think she's taking that many measures to grow the economy. Reform, public sector reform, she will announce major changes on that, as indeed as the Prime Minister, but that takes time to feed through. So it comes down to the other 3. Austerity in terms of controlling spending. Unfortunately, the Labour Party on the backbenches wouldn't allow the Chancellor or the Prime Minister to trim spending this summer. Borrowing is already very high, so hence we come down to taxation. If you're not controlling spending and if you're already borrowing, then it's taxation. But coming back to your question, at least there will be some clarity after this. And coming back to one of your earlier questions, at least it should be the case that interest rates do head lower in the new year.
If we turn then, Matt, to away, I guess, from the broader political outlook, the broader economic outlook, and come back into sort of people's homes and think about things that people are worried about, what would your main comments be if you were talking to sort of clients of yours at Netwealth? What would your sort of final takeout be for people thinking about the budget coming up, worried about what's going on? What would you say to them?
Well, going back to one of the positives actually as well, and linked to that is, I think one of the positives is it's engaging people to take stock and work out where they are. So let's think what we can do. There's loads of things we can be worried about that we can't control. But we can take stock of where we are today and start to plan and understand our positioning and think about the things where we can make a difference. So whether it be worrying about passing wealth on an inheritance tax, well, the first thing you have to do is understand what you need for your own needs over time. And many people don't have a good handle on that. What I've been pleased to see is people are starting to say, well, let's do that work. Let's engage with someone about that. Because if you do that, you have more confidence. You can narrow it down to fewer decisions that actually need to be made that will make a difference through time. And then you can work out whether you actually want to do anything. So let's take gifting still as that same point. If you're not ready to gift any money to anyone, then the price you pay is that there'll be some inheritance tax. But at least when you've thought about that, then you can be at peace with that decision. If you've never done the planning or thinking about it, you're not really in control of that decision and the worry builds up. And that's what we see. So what we're trying to say to people is, plan for the future, make some sensible, prudent assumptions. Say, for example, one of the things that's being talked about is that there will be a stealth tax, that the income tax rates will just get frozen and the allowances will get frozen. Okay, so we model for that in our planning. So we assume out of the next 30 years, there's no increases on those, which is an inherently conservative bit of modelling. It may come to light and turn out not to be that conservative, but you do that sensible thing, and that helps you make more informed decisions, and it boils it down to the things you can control. You get a bit more agency in the decision making, which hopefully makes you less anxious about what's going on. And then if things do change, you can react to them and update your plans.
And Gerard, a sort of final takeout from you for listeners to this webinar.
Yeah. Well, one thing we probably haven't talked about is wealth taxes. So maybe the fact that the government has ruled out wealth taxes. Countries that tried wealth taxes have seen them fail. There were 12 OECD countries, Western economies, and they had wealth taxes. They shrunk down to 3. Colombia joined the OECD. So there's 4 countries. But what happened was that wealth taxes tended to not bring in the revenue expected, tended to damage the economy, and the very wealthy moved. Things that are mobile moved if they're taxed more. So those taxes tended to fall more on the middle income. So what we're likely to see in this budget is that if the Chancellor doesn't go for those big taxes that we talked on, and she's thankfully likely to rule out a wealth tax, we're going to have this piecemeal approach. So it's very much back to Matt's point about sort of being proactive. But from an economic perspective, the UK is in the same boat as many other countries, but in Western Europe. But in the past, we've proved resilient. Since 2016, since we left the European Union, of the G7 countries, we've grown faster than all but America and Canada. Since the beginning of 2020, we've grown faster than all but America, Canada, and Italy. As bad as things are, we're not alone, and so we need to face up to those structural problems. If the Chancellor doesn't address all these issues in the budget, one hopes that as we move into the new year, companies and individuals will start to feel that their balance sheets and their savings give them a bit more room for manoeuvre. But it's a difficult environment, there's no doubt about that.
It certainly feels very difficult, I think, judging by the reader comments and questions. But the main takeout for me is planning. It is, of course, difficult to plan when politically goalposts are moving. But as you say, Matt, I think starting to engage, starting to think about the big questions, inheritance, pension tax and property, I know definitely on people's minds. It's been a real delight to bring you this Telegraph Media Group hosted event for Netwealth. Thank you so much out there for joining the conversation, and thanks again to Matt and Gerard from Netwealth.
Thank you.